Colin hesitated before stepping out of the battered sedan that had dropped him off. The driver, an older woman who hardly spoke, had offered him a quiet nod of good luck before pulling away. Now, with the taillights disappearing down the dark road, Colin found himself utterly alone, standing at the end of the long driveway he had once called his own. The cool evening air wrapped around him like a strange, unfamiliar embrace. 7 years. It was more than just time. It was an entire lifetime lost behind bars. The last rays of the setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn, making everything look slightly distorted, like he was staring into a dream. He closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. The tangy scent of damp grass and the faint perfume of blooming flowers drifted toward him. A real question echoed in his mind. What if everything has changed? But he was home. That word felt heavy on his tongue, because home had kept him sane for 7 years. Home was where Iliana and Sage were, where he belonged. No matter what he had told himself, I'm going back to them. At first glance, nothing seemed different about the house itself. It was exactly as he remembered. A pristine 2-story with clean white siding, navy blue shutters, and a well-tended front lawn. Colin's gaze snagged on the flower beds near the porch. He couldn't help but recall the spring weekends he and Iliana had spent there, kneeling in the dirt, planting seeds and joking about who had less of a green thumb. He remembered the sunburn Iliana had gotten on the back of her neck and how he rubbed a low on it until she fell asleep against his shoulder. That was before everything fell apart. The soft glow of interior lights spilled through the windows, and he could almost taste the warmth, the laughter, the comfort, the sense of family that had kept him company in his cell every night. His heart thundered as he took a step forward, boots crunching on gravel. Iliana, Sage, will they still want me? He had served his sentence, but the guilt and regret had never faded. He had counted down every day, believing that if he just endured, he'd eventually earn the right to walk back through that door and pick up where he left off. A burst of laughter floated through the twilight, momentarily freezing him in place. Sage's laughter. Despite the fear gnawing in his gut, the sound filled him with a familiar warmth. He took one shaky step after another, rounding the corner of the house. The old oak tree came into view, the same sturdy trunk that had held up Sage's wooden swing for as long as she could walk. His breath caught in his throat when he saw her. Sage, his baby girl, pumping her little legs, going higher and higher. She wasn't a toddler anymore. She had grown tall and lean, her blonde curls bouncing around her shoulders. She was 7 now, 7 years old. He swallowed hard. That's my daughter. The daughter he hadn't hugged since she was barely speaking in sentences. She was giggling, head thrown back, eyes bright with pure joy. Colin's heart clenched. He wanted to run to her, scoop her up, spin her around, and tell her how much he loved her. He had replayed that moment in his head over and over again, counting down to it, wanting it more than anything in the world. Before he could move, his eyes drifted to another figure standing by the swing. Iliana. She was just as he remembered. Petite frame, wavy brown hair that caught the light, and that half-smile she used to give whenever Sage did something adorable. Even from where he stood, Colin could see the tenderness in her eyes as she watched their daughter. But Iliana wasn't alone. A second figure stood close, too close, an arm lightly resting around her waist. Colin's vision seemed to blur at the edges. Alistair. That single name sent a chill through him. Alistair had been Colin's closest friend since they were teenagers in the foster system. They had sworn to look out for each other, even after they left that rough foster home behind. Alistair was the one who had introduced Colin to half the jobs he'd ever had. Alistair was the one who knew how much Iliana and Sage meant to Colin. Alistair was supposed to be family. Shock tore through Colin's chest, making it hard to breathe. He watched Iliana lean into Alistair's arms, pressing her lips gently against his. Just a quick, intimate kiss, something a loving wife might do when she thinks no one is watching. Colin's pulse pounded so loudly in his ears that he almost missed the next sound. Sage's voice, crystal clear and filled with excitement. "Daddy, push me again." Colin's heart soared for a split second at the word, "Daddy," but it immediately plummeted when he saw Sage looking at Alistair. Her eyes were lit up with admiration, her arms reaching out for him. She was calling him Daddy. The reality hit Colin like a punch to the gut. Sage didn't recognize him. She had grown up with Alistair as her father figure, while Colin was locked away, erasing himself from his own family's life for a crime he hadn't even committed. He felt his body begin to tremble, and for a moment he thought he might stumble forward, shouting, shaking, demanding an explanation. How could Iliana do this? Why didn't she tell Sage the truth? He took a small step back instead, concealing himself in the darkness beyond the porch light. He realized in that moment that Iliana had effectively rewritten their story. While he wasted away behind bars, she gave their daughter a whole new version of a father, one who was present, free, and able to hold her hand whenever she was scared. Colin heard the echo of Sage's laughter again. It felt like salt on a fresh wound. He was an intruder now, a ghost haunting his old life. As his hands curled into fists, he found he couldn't speak. He couldn't step forward, couldn't reveal himself. He had been replaced. Turning quietly, Colin slipped back into the dark, his heart shattering with every step. They hadn't even noticed him. The wind rustled through the oak tree branches overhead, but it offered him no comfort. By the time he reached the curb, he could still hear Sage laughing, could still see Iliana's smile in his mind, and still feel Alistair's hand at her waist. In 7 years, Colin had never felt so painfully alone. As he walked aimlessly down the sidewalk, far from the house that was no longer truly his, Colin's mind drifted to the past. Memories sprang up like old photographs he couldn't put away. Iliana and I had always bonded over the fact that we were orphans, tossed around in the foster care system. We didn't have biological families to lean on, so we made each other our whole world. It started when Colin was 13 and Iliana was 11. A social worker had placed them in the same foster home, a cramped 2-bedroom townhouse run by a harried older couple who already had 3 other foster kids. The place was never quiet. There was always some argument about chores or who got the bigger plate at dinner. But to Colin, it was just another house among many in his short life, a temporary pit stop on his journey to nowhere in particular. From the moment he met Iliana, though he recognized a kindred spirit, she was shy, always ducking her head and mumbling answers, but she had a keen sense of observation. She noticed everyone's habits, like who was lying about doing the laundry, or who was sneaking snacks late at night. Colin found her fascinating. In return, Iliana was drawn to Colin's protectiveness. If someone teased her for being small or quiet, he would stand between them, glaring until they backed off. He didn't fight often, but the threat was always there. Nobody messed with Iliana. Their bond sealed one afternoon when the foster parents accused Iliana of breaking a lamp in the living room. She insisted she was innocent. She'd been in her room reading. Colin believed her, but their foster father wouldn't let up, and Iliana ended up sodding in the corner. Colin, outraged, took the blame. He said he knocked it over by accident, that he'd been goofing around. The punishments in that house were typically stern lectures or extra chores, and that day was no exception. But Colin saw Iliana's grateful eyes peeking through her tears, and he realized something crucial. It was worth it. From that day on, Iliana and Colin were inseparable. Yet the foster system had other plans. In months, the state discovered issues of neglect in the household, and all 5 kids were removed and placed elsewhere. The last memory Colin had from that place was Iliana's small hand clutching his. They stood in a hallway while social workers buzzed around, ignoring them. Iliana was crying, her eyes big and frightened. They had no idea if they'd ever see each other again. They locked pinkies in a promise. "I swear," Colin said, voice cracking with emotion. "I swear," Iliana echoed. He was whisked away. She disappeared behind a doorway led by a social worker. After that, It was a blur of new faces and new homes. Colin never forgot her, though. Over the years, he kept wondering if Iliana was okay, if she managed to find a better foster family, if she was safe. When he turned 18 and aged out of the system, he took any odd job he could find. He lived in cheap motels, crashed on friends' couches, and saved every spare dollar until he had enough to search for Iliana. It took almost 2 years of phone calls, online searches at public libraries, and chasing vague leads. And then, one crisp fall evening, he found her in a small diner on the outskirts of town. She was wearing a worn-out apron, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, serving coffee and pie to locals who barely noticed she existed. But the moment she saw him, the tray in her hands almost slipped. Her eyes lit up, like she wasn't sure if she was seeing a ghost. Colin. Her voice was shaky, carrying the weight of years spent apart. He grinned, heart pounding. "Hey, Elle," he said. She let the tray clatter onto the counter and ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. For a second, he thought she was going to cry, but she just laughed into his shoulder. It felt like coming home in a way he had never experienced before. They spent that night talking in his truck. She got off work at midnight, and they parked by a deserted baseball field, the headlights cutting through the darkness. She told him about her own string of mediocre foster homes, how she ended up working in a diner for tips that barely covered rent. He told her about his cleaning gigs, scraping by, determined to find her. By the time dawn broke, they were half asleep, but Colin's mind was made up. He wasn't letting Iliana slip away again. Their relationship was a natural progression. Living together in a cramped one-bedroom apartment felt like a massive upgrade from the foster system. They were both free. They had each other. They married at City Hall. No family to invite. No big reception. Just the two of them signing papers and giggling at the gravity of it all. The wedding photo someone snapped with a cheap phone camera showed two people who had never been happier. A year later, Iliana was pregnant. They didn't have money for a fancy nursery, but Colin did extra shifts at his cleaning jobs to buy a second-hand crib. Iliana painted the walls with cheerful colors, carefully spelling out Sage in smooth cursive letters above the crib. Even before she was born, Sage was their anchor, the promise that they'd finally have a family of their own, something real and permanent. But the pregnancy was rough. Iliana had complications from the start, leading to a premature labor. Sage came into the world so tiny that Colin's hands dwarfed her entire body. There were weeks of fear in the NICU, nights of Iliana crying quietly, blaming herself. Colin tried to soothe her, but he was petrified too, terrified they might lose the only blessing life had given them. Eventually, Sage stabilized, and they brought her home. That's when a whole new struggle began. The days and nights blurred together in a cycle of feedings, doctor visits, and financial worry. Colin was working more hours, leaving Iliana alone with a fragile infant who needed near-constant care. She was exhausted, anxious, and distant. Their once cozy apartment felt suffocating. Late-night arguments became as common as lullabies. One night, after Sage had finally fallen asleep, Colin found Iliana standing by the crib, her arms wrapped protectively around herself. The silence in the apartment felt like a physical pressure. "She's so small," Iliana whispered, eyes glassy with tears that never quite fell. "What if something happens to her? What if?" Colin gently placed his hands on her shoulders. "Don't think that way," he said, voice tight with his own fear. "She's stronger than we give her credit for. She'll be okay." Iliana's voice trembled. "I'm just so tired, Colin. I'm scared all the time. And we have no family to call, no one to help. It's always just us." She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with a loneliness he recognized too well. They leaned on each other because that was all they'd ever known. No parents to give advice, no siblings to watch Sage for a few hours. It was them against the world, and sometimes that weight felt impossible to carry. He pulled Iliana into his arms, resting his chin on the top of her head. "I know it's hard," he murmured, "but we'll figure it out. We always do." Iliana let out a shaky sigh. "We used to talk about everything. Now I feel like we just trade off who's taking care of the baby. We barely look at each other." He kissed her hair. "We won't lose us, I promise." Even in their exhaustion, they shared a tender moment. Iliana's body relaxed against his, and for a moment it felt like they were back in his truck, dozing under the stars, dreaming about a bright future that was finally within reach. They did fight their way through that first year, adjusting day by day. Sage grew stronger. Iliana regained some of her spark, and Colin fell more in love with both of them. They were a family. And that's what made it all the more heartbreaking when the accident happened. A single moment that toppled everything they had built. The night of the accident was heavy with fatigue. Sage had fallen ill with a fever, and Iliana and Colin had spent most of the day in a cramped waiting room at the children's hospital, fretting over their daughter's condition. The doctors kept them late, running tests, prescribing medication, advising them to keep a close eye on her. By the time they finally got Sage stable enough to go home, both parents were swaying on their feet from lack of sleep. They loaded Sage, sleeping fitfully, into her car seat in the back. Colin offered to drive, but Iliana insisted she could handle it, claiming that she needed to focus on something besides her swirling anxiety. The roads were nearly empty at that hour, a light drizzle coating the asphalt. Colin fought to keep his eyes open in the passenger seat. The quiet whir of the heater lulled him into a half-doze, and every time he blinked, it took a few seconds for his eyes to reopen. At one point, he glanced over and noticed Iliana gripping the steering wheel, tension radiating from her posture. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, voice hoarse from too many hours awake. She gave a curt nod. "I'm fine, just tired." "Maybe pull over," he suggested. "I'll walk around, wake myself up, and then I can drive the rest of the way." Iliana rubbed her eyes with one hand, still keeping the other on the wheel. "We're so close, Colin. 10 more minutes." But those 10 minutes might as well have been an eternity. Colin's eyelids drooped again, and he let them close just for a heartbeat. When he opened them, the first thing he noticed was the eerie silence. No hum of the tires, no murmur of the engine's strain. It was like the car had momentarily glided off the road. He snapped upright. "Iliana," he said sharply. He saw her head jerk up from an alarming tilt forward. Her eyes went wide, panic flooding them, as if she'd just realized she'd been microsleeping. She yanked the steering wheel desperately. The sudden motion threw Colin against the car door. The tires screeched. A metallic thud reverberated through the chassis, jarring Colin's bones. Iliana screamed, her foot slamming down on the brakes. The entire car lurched and then skidded, eventually coming to a stop that tossed them both against their seatbelts. For a moment, the world was silent except for the sound of Sage's wail from the backseat. Colin's heart hammered wildly. He fumbled for the door handle, adrenaline surging as he unbuckled himself. "Stay here," he barked, even though Iliana looked too shocked to move. "Check on Sage." He stumbled out into the chilly night air, a faint mist clinging to his skin. The headlights illuminated the road in front of them, jagged shards of plastic and a toppled construction roadblock. Its battered reflective sign lay crumpled under the car's front bumper. Relief rose in him. Maybe they just smashed into some abandoned equipment. His pulse started to slow, if only slightly. He was about to step forward to clear the debris when he saw the shape on the ground. At first, he thought it was another piece of the roadblock, some large chunk of debris, but as he moved closer, his stomach twisted. It was a man, curled on his side, partially under the bumper. A backpack strap was tangled around his arm, his legs bent at an unnatural angle. "Oh God," Colin whispered, voice trembling. He dropped to his knees beside the stranger, afraid to touch him, but terrified not to. Up close, the man looked to be in his mid-20s, eyes fluttering, shallow breaths making his chest stutter. Behind him, Iliana's voice cut through the darkness. "Colin, She was standing behind the open driver's door, looking as though she might collapse. "It's he. He's alive," Colin said. Barely, he thought. The man's breathing was ragged, wet-sounding. Blood seeped from a gash on his forehead, trickling down his cheek. "Iliana, call 911. Her eyes were wild, darting between the injured man and Colin. "No," she croaked, voice cracking on that single syllable. Colin stared at her in disbelief. "We need an ambulance. He could die, Iliana." She shook her head so violently, her hair whipped across her face. "They'll arrest me. They'll say it's my fault. We'll lose everything. Sage needs me." Desperation clogged her voice, and tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. "Don't you understand? I fell asleep at the wheel. They'll send me to prison, Colin. I can't leave Sage. I can't." Her words made no sense to him, not in that moment. A man was bleeding out on the road. We can't just." In the distance, red and blue lights reflected against the mist, approaching fast. Someone must have seen or heard the crash and called it in. Colin looked back at Iliana, at the absolute terror in her eyes. He remembered every single day they'd struggled, every time they'd been told they had no family to rely on. Now they had Sage, but Sage still needed medication, doctor visits. Iliana was the only stable caregiver, while he was out working multiple jobs. Or at least, that was the story until now. She grasped his arm, nails digging into his skin. "Please, Colin, please," she whispered, voice raw with fear. "I'm begging you." The sirens got louder. Colin's heart pounded. He thought of Sage, fragile in her car seat, barely recovered from her illness. If Iliana went away, who would take care of her? Her eyes, wide and pleading, cut him deeper than any blade. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry, but I can't lose her." In that split second, Colin made a choice that would cost him years of his life. He stood up just as the police car rolled to a stop, lights flashing, the officers stepping out with urgent expressions. Colin raised his hands, stepping forward so they'd focus on him, not Iliana. "I was driving," he shouted, voice trembling but resolute. "I hit him. I swear it was an accident." It was as though time folded in on itself. Everything happened in a blur. One officer tended to the man on the ground, radioing for medical assistance. Another approached Colin, instructing him to keep his hands visible. Iliana hovered in the background, tears slipping down her cheeks. But she never spoke up. She never said a word to contradict Colin's story. Over the next few hours, between the arrival of an ambulance and the glaring lights of a makeshift investigation scene, Colin repeated his confession. He said he dozed off, that the man came out of nowhere. He insisted it was his fault alone. Iliana was merely a witness, too distraught to drive the rest of the way home. The officers took his statement, asked him a barrage of questions. He stuck to his story, swallowing the bitter taste of lies. Then as dawn broke, an officer walked up to him, removing his hat, his expression grim. "The man didn't make it," he said quietly. "He died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital." A sickening wave of nausea rolled through Colin. He felt his knees buckle. "It's real now." Another officer read him his rights, and cold handcuffs locked around his wrists. Iliana stood off to the side, holding Sage close. Her face was streaked with tears, but her lips remained pressed tightly shut. Colin refused to meet her eyes. The trial was not lengthy. With Colin's unequivocal confession, the prosecution had more than enough to paint him as a reckless driver who caused a fatal accident. His own public defender tried to argue for leniency, mentioning how Colin was a father, how he had been exhausted after a hospital visit. But the family of the victim was there, somber and grieving, demanding justice. In the end, the judge handed down an 11-year sentence. Colin's gaze swept the courtroom as the gavel fell. He saw Iliana cradling Sage in her lap in the back row. Sage was far too young to understand what was happening. But Iliana understood. Her eyes locked on Colin's, radiating a complex mix of gratitude, guilt, and heartbreak. Yet she still didn't speak up. No last-minute confessions, no tearful interruptions to say she was the one driving. Colin swallowed the bitter truth. She wasn't going to save him. That was the deal he made. He couldn't even blame her. He'd chosen this. Days blurred into weeks as they prepared him for his new life behind bars. The fortress of concrete and iron doors swallowed him whole. He counted the hours by the shifting of sunlight through barred windows. The nights were the worst. Echoes of distant voices, the clang of keys, and the memory of the man he had inadvertently killed. Why did I do this? He would ask himself. But he always knew the answer. Iliana, Sage, their future. And then there were the 7 years that followed. 7 years before a successful parole. 7 years of staring at the same cinder-block walls, lying awake in a lumpy bunk, wondering if Iliana still thought about him. If Sage would remember him at all. If they could ever be a family when he got out. He'd get scraps of information whenever Iliana visited, but the visits became fewer, and eventually they stopped altogether. The prison chaplain once handed him a letter from Iliana, explaining that raising Sage alone was complicated, and that visiting him in prison made it worse. Colin shoved the letter in the bottom of his footlocker and never read it again. But every night he dreamed of the day he'd come home. Of Iliana running into his arms, telling him how much she missed him. That they'd find a way to make this work. He pictured Sage bright-eyed and full of innocence, hugging him and calling him Daddy. In his cell, Colin repeated their names like a prayer, forcing himself to believe there was still hope in the world. Then, on the day of his release, he had nowhere else to go but home. A friend from prison gave him enough money for a ride, and some cheap clothes, his heart hammered with a mix of dread and anticipation. He held on to the memory of Iliana's laughter, the scent of her hair, and the feel of Sage's tiny hand gripping his finger. That was enough to push him forward. Yet here he was, standing in the shadows of his own yard, watching Iliana kiss Alistair, seeing Sage run to him, calling him Daddy. The final blow. He'd lost them. Not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, in every sense that mattered. Colin's eyes burned with tears he refused to shed. He felt as if he were locked out of his own life, vanished to roam outside the windows. For 7 years, he had endured the isolation of prison, comforted only by the dream of returning to his family. Now he realized that those 7 years had given Iliana ample time to move on, to rewrite their story with a different ending. Shivering, he walked away, fists clenched in his pockets. He didn't know where he was heading or what he'd do next. He just knew he couldn't watch them like that a second longer. Iliana had erased him, and there was nothing he could say to get those lost years back. As the darkness swallowed him up, he thought of that silent courtroom, the gavel echoing against the walls. He pictured the man they had hit on that desolate road. He heard Sage's laughter drifting through the air, sweet as honey but belonging to someone else now. He tasted regret on his tongue like poison. He had taken the blame for his wife's crime, and all that remained was a single question, lingering in the night like the faint smell of wildflowers. Was it worth it? He had no answer. Prison was nothing like Colin had imagined from movies or TV shows. No dramatic introductions, no immediate confrontations in a gloomy cell block. Instead, it hit him like a slow, creeping fog. The high concrete walls crowned with razor wire seemed to swallow him whole the moment he walked through the gates. The guards barely looked him in the eye. To them, he was another inmate in a long line of unfortunate souls. The thick scent of disinfectant clung to the corridors, but underneath that lingered a stale odor of sweat, regret, and the echoes of too many broken spirits. The clang of metal doors became a constant in his new reality. Each time a door slammed shut, it resonated in his bones, a jarring reminder that his freedom was gone. He had chosen this, chosen to take the fall for Iliana. On the darkest nights, when he lay awake in his bunk, listening to the distant coughs and mutterings of fellow inmates, he repeated one mantra: Sage needs her mother. He clung to that thought because it was the only reason he hadn't gone insane. The first few months inside were the hardest. Prison had its own set of rules, an unspoken hierarchy that Colin had to learn quickly if he wanted to avoid fights. He wasn't a fighter, not by nature, but he also wasn't going to be anyone's punching bag. His strategy was simple. Keep his head down, don't snitch, and steer clear of trouble. He often volunteered for cleaning duty or kitchen shifts, anything that let him stay busy and out of the crossfire. But no matter how many mops he pushed or potatoes he peeled, he couldn't escape the crushing loneliness that weighed on him when the lights went out. That loneliness was the real punishment. Colin had never been the life of the party, but at least on the outside he had Iliana and Sage. He had hope. Now he had nothing but memories of a life he wasn't sure he'd ever get back. Letters from Iliana arrived occasionally, the envelope smudged, the handwriting rushed. He devoured every word, searching for some sign of warmth, of reassurance that their sacrifice was worth it. Her updates about Sage's health were short and factual. Sage's scribbles would sometimes be included, childish loops and lines that only a parent could treasure. For Colin, those photos and little drawings became lifelines. He taped them to the underside of his bunk, so he could see them right before sleep, a tiny reminder of why he was enduring this. A few weeks into his sentence, he got an unexpected visit. Iliana and Sage showed up in the visitors' area, separated from him by a long metal table. The guards watched like hawks. Personal contact was limited to a quick hug if you were lucky. Colin's chest tightened the moment he spotted his daughter. Sage looked so small in Iliana's arms, her wide eyes scanning the echoing room. She didn't recognize him. She was only a year old, too young to piece together how her father ended up behind these cold walls. "Hey, sweetheart," Colin managed, voice catching in his throat. It felt like speaking around a lump of nails. Sage squirmed in Iliana's lap, offering Colin no greeting. She hid her face in her mother's shirt, and each time Colin tried to coax her with a soft smile, she only blinked, uncertain. Iliana gave him a weary, forced smile. "She's been doing better, health-wise. Doctor says she's catching up on weight." "That's good." Colin nodded, swallowing the ache in his throat. "I'm just glad you brought her." Iliana hesitated, shifting Sage in her lap. "I don't think I'll bring her again," she said, her voice taut with resolve. "I don't want her to remember any of this. I want her to have as normal a childhood as possible." Colin stared, unable to process her words immediately. "But I'm her father. I need to be part of her life somehow." A hint of guilt flickered across Iliana's face, but she held firm. "I'll send pictures, letters, but I can't keep bringing her here. This place." Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry." That was the last time Colin saw his daughter in person. The memory of Sage turning away from him, too shy or too confused to reach out, haunted him more than any threat on the prison yard ever did. Over time, Iliana's visits dropped from once every few months to once or twice a year, and each visit felt more distant than the last. She'd fill him in on routine details, Sage's first steps, her new daycare, the cost of groceries, but she never stayed long. She always seemed eager to leave, as though the prison walls were pressing in on her too. Eventually, Colin stopped asking when she'd come back, because the answer was always, "I'm not sure." And that hurt almost as much as her not coming at all. Alistair, on the other hand, made a few visits of his own. He showed up twice a year, looking every inch a successful businessman in tailored suits and polished shoes. It was jarring for Colin to see his old friend dressed like that, as if he belonged to a different social stratum entirely. "Hey, buddy," Alistair would greet him, forcing a tight grin. "How are they treating you in here?" Colin forced a neutral expression. "Same as everyone else. I keep my head down." Alistair would nod, leaning back in the plastic chair with a posture that seemed almost too relaxed for a prison visitation room. "Business is good. I'm keeping your share aside. Iliana and Sage don't want for anything." Colin tried to trust those words. It was comforting to think his small house-cleaning venture, which Alistair had expanded, was still generating enough money to support his family. Sometimes, Colin even allowed himself a flicker of gratitude. But there were moments he caught flickers of something off in Alistair's tone, or the way he avoided certain topics. Colin's gut twisted, but he couldn't bring himself to press too hard. If he lost Alistair's help, then Iliana and Sage might struggle, so he nodded and told himself everything was fine, clinging to the belief that he'd eventually get out and set things right. The only person who brought him any real hope from the outside was his attorney, Giselle. She was young but fierce, her hair always twisted into a neat bun, her sharp eyes scanning him like she could see every secret he tried to hide. Giselle didn't sugarcoat anything. She'd come into the consultation room carrying thick files and an attitude that could flatten lesser lawyers. "We've got a shot at parole," she announced one day, dropping the files onto the table. "It's not a guarantee, but you've been a model inmate. No major infractions, clean behavior record. You do the work details." Colin felt his pulse quicken. "What's the timeline?" 6 months if we play our cards right," Giselle said. She gave him a small, encouraging smile that made Colin's chest tighten with cautious optimism. "You do exactly what you've been doing. Show them you're reformed, that you're not a danger to anyone, and we might get you out of here early." For months, Colin lived on that hope. He stayed out of trouble, avoided petty scuffles, did his job in the prison laundry. Even when a skinny, loud-mouthed inmate named Riker snatched a photo of Sage from him, Colin clenched his fists but held back. That picture was precious. Sage, maybe 3 years old at the time, smiling in a blue sundress. But he couldn't risk blowing his chance at parole. He only snapped when Riker made a snide remark about how adorable Sage was and how maybe he'd write her someday. Colin's punch was immediate, cracking across Riker's jaw. The guards swarmed, pinning Colin to the concrete floor. He spent a week in solitary confinement for that one. He nearly jeopardized the parole hearing, but ironically, Riker never bothered him again. Sometimes, the only language prison bullies understood was force. Giselle was furious, but she managed to keep his record mostly clean, and for that, he was more grateful than he could ever express. Then came the day he never thought would arrive. The warden called his name, informing him his parole had been granted. After serving 7 years of an 11-year sentence, Colin walked out of that place with a box of personal belongings tucked under his arm, mostly letters and photos, and a knot of dread in his stomach. He stepped beyond the gates into the glaring sunlight, squinting at the wide-open sky. Giselle was there waiting in her car, engine idling. The moment he climbed in, she glanced at his gaunt face, the shadows under his eyes. "You look like you haven't seen daylight in years," she muttered, trying to mask her concern with a wry tone. He let out a shaky breath. "I haven't really lived in years, so, yeah." She tossed him a bottle of water. "Drink. You'll feel better." Colin sipped, tasting freedom in every swallow. The next step was both exhilarating and terrifying. He was going home, or at least to the place he still called home, even if everything had changed. The car ride to his old neighborhood felt surreal. Colin couldn't stop himself from fidgeting, fingers tapping on the door handle, knee bouncing in nervous anticipation. Giselle cast him occasional sidelong glances. "You sure you don't want to call first?" she asked softly. "Give them a heads up." "No," Colin said quickly, then faltered. "I mean, I don't know. I don't want to scare them, but I have to see them. I need to see Iliana and Sage. I waited 7 years." Giselle nodded, but her expression was cautious, like she knew this homecoming might not go the way he was imagining. Colin had wondered the same thing every single night. Will they even want me anymore? Eventually, they turned onto the tree-lined street he once knew like the back of his hand. The sight of familiar houses stirred a flurry of emotions. Nostalgia, excitement, fear. When the car rolled to a stop in front of his old home, Colin stared. It looked the same, that snug 2-story with white siding and navy blue shutters. The same porch swing he'd painstakingly assembled, though the paint was chipped now. A pang hit his chest as he remembered Iliana laughing when he got splinters trying to put it together. He forced himself out of the car, legs shaky. Giselle stayed put, her eyes following him as if ready to step in if things went south. He took a tentative step toward the backyard, after hearing muffled voices and laughter drifting from somewhere behind the house. That laughter, a child's laughter, sent a jolt of hope through him. She had to be 7 or 8 by now. He approached the wooden fence carefully, peering around it, and there they were, a snapshot of domestic bliss that shattered his heart. Sage on a swing, her hair shining under the late afternoon sun. Iliana gently pushing her, a small smile curving her lips, and standing close behind them. An arm draped around Iliana's waist was a Lister, the last person Colin expected to see so intimately close to his wife. Colin's stomach twisted. He tried to breathe, but his lungs felt clogged with an emotion that bordered on rage and sorrow. He watched Alistair lean in and press a light kiss to Iliana's temple. She glanced up at him with a look of gentle affection that used to belong to Colin alone. Sage giggled, calling out, "Daddy, can you push me higher?" Colin almost stepped forward. "Daddy," the word jolting him like an electric current. Then he realized Sage was looking at Alistair, arms outstretched, fully trusting him to keep her safe. That one scene tore a hole in Colin's chest. His daughter saw Alistair as her father. His immediate urge was to stride in, confront Iliana, demand to know what was going on. But he found himself stuck in place, fists clenched so tight his knuckles went white. Reality sank in. While he was rotting behind bars, Alistair had stepped seamlessly into his life. No wonder the business was thriving. Alistair had taken it all. Colin felt betrayed and painfully foolish for not seeing it sooner. A swirl of conflicting thoughts battled in his head. Fury at Iliana's apparent betrayal, sorrow for Sage growing up without knowing the truth, and humiliation at having once trusted Alistair with his family. She probably needed help, his rational side insisted. You were gone. Alistair was there, but that didn't stop the bitterness from pulsing through him. Colin backed away, stumbling a little, trying to keep quiet. He didn't want them to see him, not yet. He had no idea what he'd even say. The sound of Sage's laughter followed him like a cruel reminder of everything he'd lost. When he turned toward the car, Giselle had already stepped out, her brow furrowed in concern. She looked past him at the backyard scene. Her voice was soft. "I'm guessing that's not what you hoped to find." Colin's jaw tensed. No, not at all. A shaky exhale escaped him. The homecoming he'd dreamed about for so long was nothing but an illusion. In its place stood a new family dynamic that left no room for him. He felt overwhelmed, like the ground had been ripped out from under him a second time. Giselle placed a hand on his arm. "Colin, listen. You can stay with me until you figure out your next step, okay?" He nodded, tears burning at the corners of his eyes, though he refused to let them fall. I can't stay here. Not like this." They got back in the car. Colin's hands trembled as he gripped the seatbelt. Silence stretched between them for a few beats, the engine quietly humming under Giselle's steady hand. Finally he spoke, voice low. "I need your help with everything. Custody, confronting Iliana, all of it because—" He paused, struggling to form the words. "I wasn't even driving that night, and I went to prison for her. She let me." Giselle's gaze flicked to him, sympathy and something else flickering in her eyes. Perhaps admiration for a sacrifice that now seemed all too one-sided. "All right," she said softly. "We'll go to my place, and we'll plan. But Colin, you need to be prepared for what might happen next. Legally, personally, everything." He forced himself to nod. "I know. I can't let this go on. Sage doesn't even know me. She thinks he's her dad." His voice cracked. "I won't let that continue. I want my family back, or at least I want the chance to tell my side." Giselle sighed. "I understand. I'm on your side, no matter what." They drove off, leaving the house, and the life Colin once knew, behind. The road ahead looked painfully uncertain, but there was no turning back. 7 years of sacrifice had led him here, to a moment he never anticipated. Fighting for a daughter who saw another man as her father, and a wife who had erased him without a second thought. Despite his heartbreak, a spark of determination took root in his chest. He had lost years, but he wasn't going to lose Sage forever. And though Giselle kept her face composed, inside she was seething on Colin's behalf. She'd read every court document, listened to every detail of that terrible night. Seeing the betrayal etched across Colin's face, recognizing how deeply he'd been played, stirred a protectiveness in her that went beyond professional duty. In the silent car, she tightened her grip on the wheel, silently vowing to fight for him. Because while the law rarely gave second chances, she was determined to make sure Colin got his. And maybe, just maybe, there was something else, an unspoken hint of feeling that had been growing in her ever since she first believed him. Together, they headed toward a future that felt anything but certain. Yet for the first time since Colin's sentencing, he had an ally by his side who refused to let him walk this path alone. Iliana had been living with quiet, relentless fear for years, a fear born on a single night that changed everything. She couldn't recall the last time she'd slept soundly. Whenever her eyes closed, she saw the aftermath of that collision. The soaked asphalt, the shattered barrier, the small figure beneath her car. That image never left her. When she looked in the mirror each morning, she saw a woman capable of letting her husband, Colin, bear guilt for a crime she committed. Colin had served time for her, and Iliana told herself it was necessary. Sage needed one parent free. Iliana rationalized that she was doing the right thing for their daughter, even though her heart pounded with guilt each day. She replaced Colin with Alistair, Colin's best friend, trying to maintain a new life. She believed that time would dull her remorse. Instead, it only sharpened. Late one evening in her dimly lit living room, she realized her secrets might not remain buried. Outside, a strong wind whistled around the house. A single lamp in the corner threw flickering shadows against the walls. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She picked it up, hesitating before reading another text from an unknown number. Every nerve in her body tensed. The messages had escalated over recent weeks, though she tried ignoring them. This one said, "Unknown. I know you hit that tourist you were driving. The world will too unless you pay." A cold wave of dread passed over her. Iliana's chest felt constricted. The words were direct, giving no room for denial. Someone had figured out her darkest secret. For years, she had dreaded a moment like this, imagining the consequences. But after letting Colin take the fall, she tried to keep the truth locked away, far from other eyes. Now, however, there was nowhere to hide. Iliana's hands shook as she typed a response. "Iliana, to unknown. Who are you? What do you want?" She waited, heart in her throat. Another message arrived. "Unknown. Transfer the money or the truth comes out. Time is running out." Her breath stuttered, anxiety roiled in her stomach. She glanced up the staircase, picturing Sage asleep in her room. Iliana remembered the day she learned Colin would accept blame for that fatal accident, letting her remain free to raise Sage. Now, a blackmailer threatened to blow it wide open. She thought about telling Alistair, but he might inform the police. That could destroy everything. She considered who else knew. Colin's defense attorney, Giselle, was aware of hidden details. Though Iliana feared Giselle's scorn, desperation overtook shame. She believed Giselle's sense of justice might override bitterness about Iliana's betrayal. Maybe Giselle could guide her. Iliana swallowed hard, grabbed a sheet of paper, and scribbled a plea. Her handwriting trembled. "Giselle, please help me. Someone's blackmailing me about the accident. I'm terrified. This could ruin Sage's life. I need advice. Could you tell Colin? I'm begging you." She folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and set off across the city. Under the cover of night, she slid it beneath the door of Giselle's law office, praying that somehow the plea would reach Colin. Early next morning, Giselle arrived at her office. Before unlocking the door, she spotted the envelope on the floor. She opened it, reading Iliana's words. Giselle's teeth clenched. She remembered the trial that sent Colin to prison, where he'd rotted for years. Now Iliana was begging for help, terrified someone had discovered the truth. Giselle flicked through mental scenarios, uncertain whether to get involved. Still, the mention of Sage tugged at her, reminding her that the child was innocent. She texted Colin, newly paroled, asking for an urgent meeting. A few hours later, Giselle showed up at his cramped apartment. Colin looked uneasy, pacing the worn carpet. He hadn't fully emerged from the bitterness of prison. She handed him Iliana's letter. He read it carefully, tension radiating from his every muscle. "She's in trouble," Giselle murmured. "Says someone knows she drove that night. She wants your advice." Colin's mouth curved into a humorless smile. "I spent 7 years rotting in a cell while she lived free with Alistair. Now she needs me. She can handle it. She's afraid the blackmailer might endanger Sage." Colin gave a slight flinch at his daughter's name. His features hardened. "Tell her to pay," he said flatly. "Tell her to deal with the consequences." "That's not exactly legal counsel," Giselle pointed out. He shrugged, bitterness etched in his eyes. "I'm not her lawyer. If she's scared, that's her burden. She left me behind. Now she can clean up her own mess." Later, Giselle sent Iliana a single text. "Colin says do what is necessary." Iliana's heart sank. She understood the subtext. Pay the blackmailer. That night, she stared at her phone screen, tears in her eyes. The blackmailer's instructions demanded a large sum. It took her years to gather enough savings for Sage's future, yet she had no choice. With trembling fingers, she initiated a transfer. Each tap of the keyboard added another spike in her chest. Over the next few days, no new messages arrived. Iliana thought it might be over. Then Child Protective Services knocked on her door. 2 social workers stood outside, Serena Winters and her colleague, holding clipboards. Iliana opened the door, forcing a smile. Serena introduced herself, voice professional. "We received an anonymous tip your daughter could be at risk. The report mentioned potential mental instability and a partner who's not her father." Iliana froze, realization hitting. "That's not accurate. I have no disorder, and Alistair is my partner. Sage is fine." Serena remained polite. "We'll need to follow up. Expect us back in a week. Please have documentation ready." They left. Iliana pressed herself against the door, legs shaking. The blackmailer had escalated. Paying hadn't ended it. She realized how powerless she was, standing on a crumbling ledge. One wrong move, and Sage might be taken away. Iliana curled her fist, cursing her fate. On a rainy evening, Iliana drove to a cafe intending to grab coffee. She'd been trying to stay calm after the CPS visit, but fear gnawed at her. As she emerged from the cafe, a haggard old man approached, rattling a plastic cup, eyes watery with desperation. "Spare change," he rasped. Iliana fished out some bills. "Here, please take it." His trembling fingers clutched the money, but his gaze turned sharp. "Murderer," he hissed. Her heart lurched. What did you say?" "You're a killer," he snarled. "No amount of money wipes blood off your hands." Iliana felt her throat close. She gripped her coffee, stumbling back. By the time she gathered herself, he'd disappeared into the night's drizzle. She rushed to her car, jolted by the sense of being watched. She kept checking her mirrors, expecting to see his accusing eyes. Little did she know, Colin sat in a nearby sit-in, headlights off, observing from a distance. He had hired that man to spook her. A surge of grim satisfaction coursed through him, imagining her panic. Yet as he watched her drive away, he felt a subtle ache, recalling the gentle woman he once loved. He forced himself to ignore it, telling himself that justice demanded her fear. Iliana's next stop was the grocery store. Colin watched her park, then signaled an older woman who waited by the entrance. Inside, Iliana gathered bread, milk, eggs. Her expression was drawn, posture stiff, eyes darting around. Suddenly, the old woman confronted her, leaning in close. "Murderess," she said, voice unwavering. Iliana jolted, nearly dropping her items. "Who? Why are you?" The woman offered no explanation. She merely repeated, "I know what you did," then walked off. Iliana left her cart, fleeing. Outside, she nearly dropped her keys, trying to unlock the car. Colin saw the raw terror on her face as she sped away. He reassured himself that she deserved this. She had lied to him, stolen years of his life, replaced him with Alistair, let her cower. That evening, Iliana pulled into her driveway. Headlights skimmed across the garage door, illuminating large, dripping red letters. "Murder." Horror engulfed her. The paint glistened under the porch light, heart hammering. She scrambled for a rag and cleaner, scrubbing with shaking arms. Her chest constricted at the idea of neighbors or Sage seeing it. She rubbed furiously, tears escaping, but the paint seemed stubborn. When she ran inside to get more chemicals, Colin crept over, dousing the letters in powerful remover. The word vanished. Stepping back out, Iliana blinked at the spotless surface. No, it was here. She touched the door, gasping at the emptiness. What's happening? Moments later, Alistair's car pulled in. He stepped out, eyeing her with concern. You're shaking. What's wrong?" She pointed helplessly. There was graffiti, "Murderer," but it's gone now. Alistair frowned. "Are you sure it wasn't kids messing with chalk?" She burst into tears, staggering away from him. This wasn't chalk, it was real paint. He tried placing a comforting hand on her shoulder, but she jerked away. She couldn't explain the depth of her fear without revealing everything. Colin observed her breakdown from across the street, swallowing hard. He'd set these events in motion, but seeing Iliana trembling against Alistair's chest sent conflicting jolts of anger and sadness through him. The next day, Colin took his plan further, targeting Alistair. While Iliana suffered, Alistair continued living comfortably. Colin couldn't forget how Alistair filled the husband role, overshadowing him as Sage's father. Worse, Colin suspected Alistair had been laundering business funds. If so, Colin wanted to bring him down. He broke into the house he once owned, searching the entryway table for the office key they used to keep there. His hands shook from memories. Iliana in the kitchen humming, Sage's baby coos from a playmat. He banished those thoughts. He was here to end Alistair's fraud. In the drawer he found the key, slipped it into his pocket, then left silently. Late that night, Colin parked behind the office building. He let himself in, flicking on a small flashlight. The corridors smelled faintly of stale coffee and bleach. Inside his old office, he began digging through ledgers and receipts, cross-checking them with files he'd previously gathered. He saw the irregularities grow undeniable. Shell companies, padded invoices, offshore accounts. Alistair's payment scheme was laid bare on every page. Colin took careful photos, heart pounding faster. Each captured image felt like a step closer to revenge. By morning, he'd emailed the entire trove, anonymously, to tax authorities and financial crime investigators. He knew the reckoning would come swiftly. He didn't have to wait long. Right after the office opened, 2 unmarked cars arrived. Colin watched from his own vehicle as dark-suited agents marched inside. Soon, employees craned their necks to see Alistair escorted out in handcuffs. People gawked, some gasping his name. Alistair shouted protests, but the agents loaded him into a car. Colin leaned back, an odd calm blanketing him. In a grim interrogation room, Alistair realized he needed a scapegoat. He recalled Iliana's desperation, deciding to pin as much blame on her as he could. She was the one who kept saying we needed more money, he insisted to the agents. She called Colin a useless dreamer. She pressured me to hide funds. The investigators listened, unimpressed, but they still noted his claims. If he linked Iliana to illicit dealings, he might reduce his own charges. Inside her home, Iliana learned Alistair had been arrested for fraud. She felt shock and dread twisting her gut. Was it connected to the blackmailer? While she pondered Alistair's fate, 2 Child Protective Services workers appeared again, more urgent now. Their raised eyebrows reflected new suspicions about Iliana's situation. News of Alistair's arrest had them concerned. Iliana had been hiding so many things that her composure cracked. Under intense questioning, she lost control. Tears brimmed as she confessed, "I was the one driving the car. Colin went to prison for me. I killed that man. I've been hiding it for years. I'm so sorry." A stunned silence engulfed them. Then, with grim faces, the CPS workers contacted the authorities. Iliana was arrested for manslaughter, evading responsibility, and conspiracy. When officers cuffed her, she barely resisted, feeling the numbing acceptance. Maybe she deserved every consequence coming her way. Alistair's trial came first. The prosecution presented evidence of money laundering and tax evasion from thousands of documents. Colin testified, revealing how he uncovered each shady transaction. Alistair's lawyer attempted to label Colin as a vengeful ex-con orchestrating a personal vendetta, but the records spoke for themselves. Alistair was found guilty and received an 8-year federal prison sentence. Then Iliana's case followed. The court gasped at revelations. She'd let her husband serve time for her fatal crash. The judge's expression was steeled. Iliana trembled, realizing how thoroughly she had destroyed her life. The manslaughter charge carried a decade in prison, with 5 more years added for conspiracy, served concurrently. She felt the blow like a physical strike. Later, as she was led away, she spotted Colin in the back. His eyes were empty, tinted with a trace of old pain. Weeks went by before Iliana saw Colin again. She sat in a dull prison visitation room that smelled like old disinfectant. He walked in, dressed in casual clothes that seemed out of place on the man she remembered. Their eyes met, tension crackling in the silence. "You look awful," he remarked, voice cold. "Prison not suiting you." She managed a hoarse laugh. "I wonder why." He folded his arms. "You let me take the blame. Now you pay." She glared at him, anger and despair flooding her. "You orchestrated everything. Strangers calling me a murderer. That graffiti, blackmail tips to CPS. Sage might hate me forever." Colin tilted his head. "She'll be better off without you. I have custody now. The court agrees you're unfit." Iliana's composure shattered. She pounded the table with her cuffed hands. "You can't steal my daughter." His expression remained stone. "I'm her father. I deserve her. You threw me away for Alistair, forced me to rot behind bars, and robbed Sage of knowing her real dad. Now you're getting what you deserve." She opened her mouth to retort, but tears won out. Her vision blurred, memories of that fateful night flooding her with guilt. Colin rose, his voice low. "Next time you lie, think about what it costs." Then he left, leaving her sobbing in a prison that became her punishment. Iliana faced her new reality. A concrete cell, fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead, and guards who rarely cared if she was stable. Inmates jeered at her, picking up on her anxieties. Her nights were haunted by nightmares of the crash. Sleep became a luxury she no longer knew. One afternoon, another inmate bumped her, mocking her tearful face. Iliana snapped, lunging without caution. Guards rushed in, dragging her away. She later saw her bruised reflection in a cracked mirror, feeling emptier than ever. Colin, meanwhile, stood in family court. With Iliana convicted and Alistair behind bars, the judge granted him full custody of Sage. He'd waited years for a chance to be her parent. Holding the signed order, he exhaled with relief. Stepping outside, he found Sage waiting with Giselle. The girl ran into Colin's arms. "Daddy?" Her bright smile pierced his heart. He gathered her up, blinking back tears. "You're mine, Sage," he whispered. She just giggled, hugging his neck. A pang of guilt coursed through him for what he'd done to Iliana, but it didn't stop his relief. Days later, they walked through a sunlit park. Sage skipped ahead, pointing at the playground. Colin followed, reflecting on lost time. Now he had the present, and a future. She squealed for him to push her swing higher, and he obliged, his throat tight. Revenge had consumed him. But now Sage was safe and loved. Weeks passed, and he and Giselle grew closer. She had always believed in his innocence. Late-night talks soothed his anger. One quiet evening, he proposed. She said yes, tears shining. Their wedding was small, filled with white flowers and soft music. Sage scattered petals, beaming. Giselle walked down the aisle, her eyes locked on Colin's. He saw compassion. She'd seen his worst and stayed. "You believed in me when I had nothing," he vowed. "I promised to protect you and Sage." Giselle's voice was steady. "I promised to stand by you and love Sage as my own." They kissed. Sage ran to them. Colin held her close, feeling redemption. Iliana and Alistair were behind bars. The past remained, but life had given him another chance.